So thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, Franzi Dinter. Well, perhaps she can participate in one of the bicycle races for the European Championships or whatever. This is my first thank you, and thank you for your patience. Actually, you expected Tom to already tell you about constitutional monarchy, and now I'm standing here and will introduce him to you a bit belatedly. So, happy to be with you. Happy that Tom is here and accepted our invitation to hold the 5th Franz Böhm lecture. And I realize it's already the 5th time, although it had been interrupted by COVID and so on. The Franz Böhm lecture is thought of honoring, first of all, Franz Böhm, one of the founders of the Freiburg School of Economics and Law. Franz Böhm, with Walter Eucken and Hans Grossmann-Dörth, founded this research group in the end of the 1920s. He was instructive in pursuing one of the main goals of the Freiburg School of Economics and Law, to establish a proper competition law in Germany after the Second World War. Eucken died in 1950, but Franz Böhm continued to live on, also as a member of the German Bundestag, the federal parliament, and was very instructive to ensure that the German competition law finally got into law and passed Bundestag and also Bundesrat, the two chambers of the federal parliament. And to honor him, we founded this lecture in a few years ago. One of the first lecturer, Ernst-Joachim Mestmecker, also a former member of the executive board of the Institute, unfortunately passed this year. He held the first Böhm lecture. He passed at the age of 93, as far as I have in mind. He became very old, and he was one of the first students of Franz Böhm, and also continued this the idea of competition law that is so important for the Freiburg School of Law and Economics. This year, we are happy that Tom Ginsberg is holding this 5th Franz Böhm lecture. He is currently the Distinguished Service Professor of International Law at the University of Chicago, Chicago Law School. Also professor of political science and faculty director of the Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression. And this is one of his most recent heavy interests in doing research, but also in political discussions. Tom has an education that stems from Berkeley. He holds a BA in Asian Studies. He finished his law degree in 1997 and then his PhD in jurisprudence and social policy in 1999. Before he entered the Chicago Law Faculty, he was professor at the University of Illinois College of Law, but he is at the University of Chicago already since 2007, first as a visiting professor, then as a full professor, and now as the distinguished service professor of international law. When you go through or read Tom Ginsberg's CV and his list of publications in the internet, I can strongly recommend this to you. You're going to see that you will listen to a very productive person holding a lot of visiting professorships that I don't count and don't mention all of them to you. Currently, he's also teaching at the University of St. Gallen, for example. He's giving advice around the world in many different countries regarding their constitutional developments. He gave talks around the world at many conferences and in many instances. this is also something that is so enormous that you cannot mention all of them. When you look at his publications and you want to know what he is actually writing about, then constitutional law is one of his favorite research objects. But reading through the publications, you will realize that Tom Ginsberg, holding this degree in law, is largely working on the edge between, or the dividing line between political science and law. And to some extent also, although to a lesser extent than with respect to political science, he's also working on the border to economics. He is, for example, in the editorial board of Constitutional Political Economy. Tom has published 5 books. The titles are, well, very clearly in this area of research that I just mentioned. So, for example, The Endurance of National Constitutions, published in 2009 by Cambridge University Press. Judicial Reputation, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2015. How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, something quite interesting for the US presidential elections coming up in November, published in 2018. And most recently in 2021, Democracies and International Law. He edited 28 books. He wrote more than 170 papers and published them in as journal articles. In addition, and I stopped counting then, a myriad of papers in collected volumes. And while he published in all the leading law journals, he published in several political science journals that are well known. So, for example, the Journal of Democracy, World Politics, the Annual Review of Political Science Quarterly, and so on. And also some of the journals of which we economists think this is, well, interdisciplinary for us. For example, the Journal of Legal Studies, of course, it's a law journal, but we find many economist papers in this journal as well. And given the idea regarding this lecture, we thought that Tom Ginsberg is actually a perfect fit for this interdisciplinary idea we had behind the Franz Böhm lecture. And so we are very happy that you accepted our invitation, that you are here. And we are very much looking forward to what you are telling us about constitutional monarchy and well, why kings and queens are still so present. I don't know who's here from the British Empire being interested in, well, the Windsors are so famous for all of us, so important. Everybody's watching what's happening in this family, and it's quite interesting to learn more about the rationale and the background of constitutional monarchy. So the floor is yours, Tom.
Let's see if I can get the mic. Yes, sounds like the mic is working. Thank you so much, Lars, for that, introduction, embarrassingly long. And thank you, Franzi, also for helping to get me here. It's a great pleasure. I've never been to Freiburg until yesterday, so I hope it won't be my last visit. There was some years ago a Netflix series in the United States called The Crown. I don't know if it made it to Germany, but okay, it was a great series, and Americans just loved it. I think one of the reasons we loved it is because when you watch that show, it makes you thank the Almighty that you were not born in the royal family. And I was watching it. It reminded me of an old anthropological literature, which identifies the kings and queens as the prisoners of society, actually. And you will see with this family, if everyone around the world knows everything you do, you're kind of a prisoner in a way. But it's a gilded cage. It's a nice cage that they live in. There was a scene in one of the episodes where the Queen Mother is saying to Queen Elizabeth, the history of monarchy in this country is a one-way street of humiliations, sacrifices, and concessions in order to survive. First the barons, that's Magna Carta, then the merchants, now the journalists. No wonder all we care about is protocol. It's all we have left as we've gone from ruling to reigning to being marionettes. And it captures something that is actually well known in the political economy literature, this idea that kings were bargaining with society and gradually losing power. But that leads to the question then of why we keep them around. Is it just to sell copies of these British tabloid newspapers? That can't be right. Perhaps there is some function they are playing for us. For Americans who live in a republic, and for many of the rest of us, it's something of a puzzle. And Germany as well. Like, why would we keep these people? And when you look around the world, you see that this is not really an anachronism. It's over 1/5 of countries are monarchies. 28 monarchs for 43 countries. I think it might be going down to 42 because Jamaica is going to leave the Commonwealth. That many other countries consider leaving and stay in. They keep the Queen of England, even though she has no relation, or the King, I guess, excuse me, I haven't updated, the King of England, even though he has no connection with them. I spent some time doing this constitutional work in a small country called Tuvalu in the middle of the Pacific. And, while it's a tiny country in the middle of the Pacific, keep as their head of state an old white man, tens of thousands of miles away with no connection. It's a puzzle. I should say most monarchies are constitutional monarchies. There's a small number of actually absolute monarchies still in place, most of them set up by the British to maintain oil interests. And that would include the House of Saud and all the Middle Eastern monarchies, Brunei. And those are actually really absolute monarchies. I'll say a little more about Brunei in a bit. But still, constitutional monarchy is a pretty important form of government. Also, if it's so useless, why do countries bring it back sometimes? Spain in 1978, Cambodia in 1993, earlier period, the Netherlands. Bhutan is it's a monarchy in the Himalayas. It's a modern monarchy. It was only started in the early 1900s. And the king sort of voluntarily trained his monarchy from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional one. He gave up power. Why is that? Also, I think, given the themes of being here at a place where constitutional political economy had such a important start, it's important to think about the relationship and whether there might be one between this form of government and markets and property rights, which we tend to think of as being important in economics. So looking across time, this is the frequency of constitutions which have a monarch as mentioned in them as the head of state. And you can see it's, now it's about 20% of countries, but it's always been pretty common. It's not declining. It's not fading away. When you think about the broader literature on monarchy, there's, I think, 4 fundamental questions, of which I will mention something, but I'm going to focus on one of them in particular. First of all, why does monarchy ever emerge? We take it for granted that we all were ruled by kings some time ago. Why is that? How does monarchy endure across generations? That's a critical question. How does succession work? And then this question, which I'm focusing on, how does a monarchy transform to powerlessness and yet stick around and maintain its function? Lots of different ways you could approach this, of course. I mentioned anthropology, historians have grappled with it, but I want to kind of take a political economy lens, and we'll see what you think of my approach when we get through it. Now, first of all, I have to define what I mean by constitutional monarchy. And constitutional monarchy is, of course, a monarchy where the head of state is a monarch, either appointed or hereditary or perhaps elected. And the reason we use the term constitutional monarchy is because in modern times, the powers of the monarch are written down in a formal constitution. And here I'm referring to my broader work I've been doing now for more than a decade and a half on constitutions of the world. It is now the case that most countries have a single written document called a constitution. That's one of the fundamental things about being a nation state now. And these consolidated texts really do grapple with the powers of monarchy. So that's a relatively modern phenomenon. It's become a norm, I'd say, since around 1940 or 50, that all new nations would have a constitutional text. But in any case, that's a part of the definition. And then the other feature, of course, is that the actual head of government, the chief executive, if you will, is not the monarch themselves. That's what makes it a constitutional monarchy. In Britain, the classic case, monarch appoints the prime minister as a formal matter, and that set of rules, which we all learned about in The Crown, is complicated and very much driven by things outside the constitutional text. The constitutional text is one thing, but it both probably overspecifies the powers of the monarch, but might also underspecify them. I'll come back to that. Thinking about this definition, then, let's put monarchy, constitutional monarchy, in a perspective with other types of regimes. And I'll start here in the upper right, where you have an absolute monarchy. I mentioned Brunei and Saudi Arabia. Those are among the most powerful monarchies that the world has ever known. Because in the pre-modern period, monarchs did sometimes have to bargain with barons and nobles. The kind of European model that we call the king in council, where the king has some important barons that they had to, and others that they had to negotiate with, was much more common. The British, in creating these oil-rich places, have created regimes with essentially no politics. I was in Brunei last year. It was the most boring place I've ever been in my life. On a Saturday night, there were 2 dingy restaurants open in the whole country, and there's no political institutions, no parliament, nothing. The people have cradle-to-grave welfare. So it's a very interesting kind of experiment in a society where you have everything materially and no politics. I wasn't applying to move there, let me put it that way. And the Saudis, of course, obviously are one of the richest monarchies in the world. It's about 2,000 members of the royal family that really matter. Most of these kings have many, many wives and many, many children, hundreds, and sometimes over 100 in some cases. But there's a core of about 2,000 of them that really do matter in terms of their internal politics. Those politics are invisible to the rest of us, of course. And the estimated wealth of the House of Saud is over $1 trillion. So this is an extremely wealthy group of people. But again, it's not, in no sense democratic and in no sense typical. Much more common historically is what I'd call the executive monarch. That is where a monarch appoints the chief executive with their discretion and does so with other political institutions around. When you had a parliament, when you have other people that you must consult with, and that's what I call an executive monarchy. We do have some surviving examples, or perhaps transitional examples, where in a country like Kuwait or Bahrain, they have set up, in response to pressures in the society, elected parliaments without power to appoint the government. They're sort of consultative things. And just last week, actually, the emir of Kuwait suspended his parliament. So this is something going on we can't fully see, but it shows that still the king is quite very much in charge in that situation. So those are both fundamentally undemocratic regimes. The country of Jordan, people think of as kind of somewhat democratic, but it's still an executive monarchy in that the king has discretion to appoint the prime minister. Now let's turn to constitutional monarchy. And this is what's interesting about it to me, is that it's a kind of form of government which its democratic quality varies. We're all familiar with the Scandinavian countries and Benelux, these very wealthy and successful democratic constitutional monarchies. At the other end of the spectrum, you have really fundamentally undemocratic ones. Cambodia is a constitutional monarchy. And I'm quite interested. I spent some time, I used to live in Japan, so I'm quite interested in medieval Japanese monarchies. There's another Netflix show now, I think, or maybe it's not Netflix, it's Hulu, called Shogun. I don't know if that's made it over here, but that's about the medieval Japanese shogunate. And in that period, the shogun was the powerful person. The emperor just sat in the palace and composed poetry. And that's been true of a lot of periods of Japanese history. So that's an example of an undemocratic constitutional monarchy. And then we have these hybrid regimes now today, Thailand, Malaysia, etc. Thinking about republics, which we tend to think of intuitively as the norm, actually some of them, I would assert, exhibit monarchical qualities. North Korea is a republic, but it's now in the 3rd generation of the family dynasty, and it has all the mythology one would expect that around a monarchy. Kim Il-sung came down from heaven on Mount Paektu and stuff. So we might be witnessing a monarchy in formation in that country. Sorry, Mom, I can't answer your call right now. My mother's what I call. Singapore Lasso as one where the son of the founding, charismatic leader governed for a while. So in any case, we do see some things which look like they might be somewhat monarchical in some sense of having multi-generations of a family. This is, when one looks just at it, this is a portion of the prior figure, just looking since 1940 of the percentage of the monarchies that are constitutional monarchies, you can see that the numbers decline. And this is because of those British creations. But Constitutional monarchies that survive, I would assert, are among the most incredibly successful countries in the world. And that's what suggests to me that maybe there is something about this form of government. So this is using the Economist's rating for the top democracies in the world. The ones that are shaded are constitutional monarchies. So even though this is, like 16, 17% of countries, it's 6 of the top 12, 7 of the top 12 in terms of democratic quality. And there are others that just below Japan and Spain and Canada, Australia, that would similarly make the top 20. Looking at the richest countries in the world, many of them are also. More than half are constitutional monarchies. The only absolute monarchy there is Qatar. And again, that's obviously a special case. But this again suggests that there's something to the form of government that is worth examining. Finally, looking at constitutional stability. This is a list of the oldest constitutions in the world, something I'm quite interested in studying. And you see only 2 of them from the top 12 are republics, Mexico and the United States. And so there's something quite significant about the stability that these things bring. All right, let's turn more broadly to monarchy in general. What are its functions? There's a lot of work in political science and such that focuses very much on the protection function of kings. Kings arise because people need protection. It's basically your local knight, goes that you have to go to his castle. Eventually, a king consolidates power. Sort of one way to think about this is if you were a person and you could gather 51% of the power in a country, and thus be able to impose your will on it, you would get 100% of the tax revenue. And that's basically the model. You provide protection from outside forces and so on. There's another line of work which views monarchy as solutions to coordination problems in society. And this is interesting. The monarchy, it's different than the local knight or different than the local small-scale society where you might know everybody. It provides a fictive kind of ontological community for people who don't know each other. So the key function of the monarchy is integrating people into almost like a collective, a fictive family. And that, if you think about it, the gains from that would increase with the scale, right? The more people I am fictively related to in my country, the more people I can transact with, the more I might trust them and such. And so there's might be really fundamental benefits to thinking about that. I like this coordination perspective rather than the classic idea that it's war. It's all about war. Probably the two things go together. You see the scales of justice have the sword and the scales. But my view is that the scales have not received enough attention in the literature. Kings as judges, kings judging cases, resolving disputes among the barons of England, providing protection for impersonal markets. This kind of function of coordinating among diverse people, I think, is pretty important and one we should get some more, put more attention to. This is a picture of King Solomon with the famous story, the parable of the 2 women who both claimed the child. And I view that as the king using, drawing on his force. So the force is important here because the king can impose a solution. But basically, is resolving problems of asymmetric information among the 2 women. Obviously, the 2 women both know whose baby it is. But what they don't know is the reservation price, if you will, of each one of them. And so the king comes on and says, hey, this is it. Why we're going to use this judging as a mechanism of information revelation, allowing justice to go forward. And notice that the king gets a little payoff there. We're still talking about Solomon today because of the wisdom that he brought to it. It suggests that there might, in some instances, be a route to the kingdom that doesn't go through the sword necessarily, but actually arises from epistemic power, an epistemic route to authority. And I just have in mind a situation where you have someone who's just really good at judging things and get a little payoff from that for each case you judge. Maybe you might actually be able to accumulate the other kind of power as well. We actually have an ancient Greek story about that. Aziz the Mede. And Aziz was this a man of mark in his village. He was applied himself to practicing justice, and people would come and made him the resolver of all his disputes. And this kept going until he got bored of it. And he said, I'm done. And then robbery and lawlessness break out. And so the people come to him and vote, essentially. That's why I use the median voter, the pun, that he should be the king. And then we have stories of him going out and wielding military authority, that the riot was epistemic, dispute resolution, solving coordination problems, essentially. Somebody who's really good at that might be providing a service to society. I spent a lot of time in East Asia, so this is from my part of the world, in Thailand. There's a very famous inscription on this stone, and it says, basically, when people have problems, they go to the king, and the king provides judgment for them. And when he decides it, people praise him. So there's a payoff from being a good judge that certainly is good for the king. It's a service for society. Now, the way I think about this is that kings, once established, have two problems. First of all, the basic idea here is that it's a bargain between the monarch and society, or the monarchy and society, in which, in exchange for fictively tax revenue, or sort of metaphorically tax revenue, the monarchs are providing services, protection, judgment, various other things, comedy in the case of the British royal family as well. But the king, in order to keep that stream of rents coming, has a kind of two-faced problem. The first one, which there's some literature on, is the problem of maintaining the power within the family. Very often, kings are killed by their own relatives. Who has the seat? Who controls the rent stream for the set of people who might be able to obtain it? So that's an internal game. And then there's an external game with society, which is about bargaining with the society for how much of the share, how much rents you'll receive, and what the share of power, metaphorically, between the society and the king will be. My intuition here is this is kind of two-level game in some sense. And as the stakes of there might be a way in which the stakes of external power, you tend to assume, of course, the king always wants to maximize the share of external power with the society. But it might be the case that if external power becomes really, really valuable, as the stakes go up, so does the risk for the internal game within the family, right? The more power you got, the more you're controlling the risk. Wow, the more likely you are to be bumped off by your brother or your brother-in-law. And so there might be a possible kind of equilibrium, I suppose, and I don't provide the formal model here, fortunately, for you. But there might be an equilibrium where the kings actually yield power in exchange for security for their position. So if you know, for example, that your heirs, not your brother-in-laws, not your cousins, yours can continue to succeed in perpetuity, then you might accept a lower stream of rents in each period. That's my basic intuition here. You might expect less of the revenue in any period because you know you'll get it for a longer time. That's constitutional monarchy. Before I get to the bargaining with society, let's talk a little bit about the internal game, succession. And this year I'm drawing actually on classic work that Lars and I were talking about last night by Gordon Tullock. He has a great book on autocracy. And if you think about it, if you're the ruler, one of your services you're providing is enforcing the bargains among your citizens. You want, as a ruler, if you enforce the bargain, that's your service. You want to make sure that there's your solutions are enduring. They're not going to be undermined by your successor. So you want a successor who will continue to uphold your bargains. That's what gives them value. But you don't want a successor who's strong enough to depose you. And that's a tension. There are examples, of course, in history where sons depose fathers. That happened, I think, in the United Arab Emirates recently, within living memory. So how do you do that? How do you get a sort of commit to your bargain? How do you solve the commitment problem for the people you're solving bargains for? And succession in a monarchic family is, of course, one general way to do that. We don't have to fight anew. This is sort of Olson's stationary bandit. We don't have to have a new fight every period. Essentially, there are three ways you can select successors. One is election, actually very common historically. Genghis Khan's descendants, that's how that's actually one reason that the Mongols never made it here. They came very close. They made it to Poland. But when the Mongol Empire, when they were expanding, when the armies were in Poland, the former Khan died. And so everyone had to go back to the election of the next Khan, and they never made it back. So you're saved from being having been conquered by the Great Mongol Empire. I'm a big fan of the Great Mongol Empire, but not everyone is. But that point about election by elites is one way you could do it. And we do have examples of that, the elective monarchy. Of course, the focal solution we now have is primogeniture. That's the one Gordon Tullock likes. We also have agnatic succession. What is that? That's a solution where the king says, each of my sons will reign in turn. So it might be like the oldest member of the family. You can imagine ways that the generational change happens at a mass level rather than proceeding through primogeniture. I want to say a little word about that because it leads me to be able to say something about the House of Saud. So Saudi Arabia's founding king, Ibn Saud, had 45 children. I think 36 survived to adulthood, and many were sons. Most were sons. And so then the question is, when he dies, what's he going to do? He actually set up a system of agnatic succession. Each of his sons would reign in turn. And when you think about that, from the point of view, the perspective of one of the sons, it creates what some of you may be familiar with the work of the economist Alvin Ross. It's an unraveling problem, and let me just describe it for those who aren't familiar. I'm, let's say, son number 10 out of 20, and I'm waiting my turn and waiting until my brothers all die. Then I know I'll be able to come into power. And I'm thinking to myself, well, what's going to happen down in the future? Eventually, son number 20, if he's still alive, will take the throne, and then it will pass to the next generation. But that, of course, leads me to think, well, boy, that means someone's sons from the next generation are going to get to keep this monarchy going. I'd rather it be mine than son number 20. And so actually son number 19 would think that way and maybe would have the temptation to break the agnatic rule and establish primogeniture. And that's, when you think about that in a game theory sense, it actually means that the very first son should try to break that rule and establish primogeniture. And that's exactly what happened in the House of Saud. The first successor, the first son, was beginning to prepare to have his own line, control the royal house. And his next youngest brother saw that and ends up deposing him and exiling him to Greece, King Faisal. And Faisal is then murdered in the 1970s. So again, this is another point. Let's say I thank the Almighty we weren't born into one of these royal families. They're vicious. But the point is that agnatic succession is a little bit unstable. We have some examples historically, but it doesn't really work. It unravels. And of course, you will all remember that this unraveling is exactly what we've recently seen with Mohammed bin Salman, right? His father was still alive, barely, King Salman. But Mohammed bin Salman would not have been king, right? He wouldn't have been crown prince. It would have been the next 2 or 3 brothers would have held it. And basically, King Salman has ended that agnatic succession, and so we're moving to the next generation. So that's it. It's an institutional instability. Well, making across time, there's some studies which suggest that primogeniture is stabilizing and more focal. So there's this book by Kokkonen and Sundahl who find that tenure under primogeniture is longer than under agnatic seniority, but also note that there's a lot of civil war, even under primogeniture. I have this intuition, which I will explore more in the eventual book I write based on this, that it's the shift away from absolute monarchy or strong monarchy to slightly weaker monarchy that actually stabilizes European monarchs. So this fellow Baj has a paper showing that before 1200, which is about the year of Magna Carta and Sachsen-Spiegel and Whitney documents, which constrain kings. Before that, monarchs were killed with much more frequently than thereafter. 20% of them die in office, and then afterwards it's 6%. Nowadays, it's really quite rare. All right, so that's succession. This was all an aside. If you think about it from the point of view of the king, maybe what you want is a mixed model. where there's kind of a presumption of primogeniture, but with the ability to avoid it and move away. And this is actually what Bhutan has. It's hereditary succession, men over women, I'm sorry to say. But if the king decides that the oldest prince is not worthy, he has a duty actually to suggest someone else. That's a kind of mixed model, which does give a lot of power. It's a presumption, but overcomable. Let me turn finally to my main point I want to talk about, which is how, when bargaining with society, can a monarch, why would no power in the monarchy be in equilibrium? That's basically the question. And thinking about this as an iterated game, we think about challengers challenging a king for a share of power. And that's going to happen over time in a repeated game. And my thought in trying to formalize this slightly would be that, when challenged by society, when the barons come and say, we want more share of your control over taxes, the king has basically three choices. They can resist, that may lead to a costly fight, or definitely costly fight, which the king might win. They might concede, in which case the king gradually loses power. And they also might, in my hypothetical here, I've got the 19th century in mind, dissolve parliament and throw it to the people and see if the people want to stick with the king's level of power or not. And I imagine that over time, one of the dynamics at play here is that as the king concedes power, it actually diversifies the economic base for the society. And this is a classic thing in the literature of how, and I think of North and Weingast here, how over time, bargaining with the king secured the property rights of the nobles and secured the power of parliament. And that led ultimately to more freedom and more markets. And so if that's true, if that dynamic generalizes, that when the king concedes, markets can become more stable, actually over time, as long as there's no rear externally, the king's power could only go down. It would do a one-way ratchet from conceding. Of course, the king doesn't have to concede. He can throw it to parliament. And so the dynamics are not predictable, or the pace of giving up power is not predictable. But as I come to later, it's very hard once you've given up power to reclaim it. We have only a couple examples where a constitutional monarchy tries to become an executive monarchy or an absolute monarchy, and it almost never works. So some dynamic there. I won't say much more about this, but this is basically the history of Europe. Kings who conceded survived. Kings who did not, found sometimes that their throne was overturned. And this is also because challengers may come in different types too. You might have some challengers who simply want more share of the power. The barons and such, what do they want? They want the particular social order to survive. But of course, in the 20th century, we also had challengers who were ideologically opposed to monarchy and would just want to eliminate it. And that's better to give in to the challengers who want to keep the regime than those who want your head. Okay. Once you have a constitutional monarchy, once it emerges, the political functions do change. The protection role is zero, right? The military is now typically controlled by the government, which is not determined by the king. And it's still possible that the king might play a role. And I call this, one that I describe as crisis insurance. Crisis insurance. What do I have in mind here? My theory is that it's something like the dispute resolution function, providing focal points when members of the society or factions within society are highly divided. We'll have a couple of famous examples. Let me show you a couple. The picture on the left there is Juan Carlos of Spain after the restoration of the Spanish monarchy in 1978. And that was a very tough restoration. It was hard bargained because you had socialists who, of course, hated Franco and hated the right and hated the monarchy. And then you had conservatives who wanted the monarchy and were reassured somewhat of the fact that Juan Carlos was going to be able to maintain himself in government. In 1981, there was a coup d'etat attempt by the military because the first government elected was socialist. So this is a good example of how, the constitutional monarchy provides a way of, in this case, what happened, I should say, is that Juan Carlos went on TV and said, after consulting with each of the generals and said, no, we're not having this coup. You're doing this coup in the name of me? No. He didn't accept that. And that allowed the socialist government to survive. It allowed Spanish democracy to survive. It was a crisis in which anything could have happened. And the king provided a focal point which allowed democracy to continue. That's the basic thing I have in mind with crisis insurance. You never know when a crisis is going to arise. But when it does, you want someone there who can help provide a focal point to resolve it. A metaphor that's sometimes used is a fire extinguisher. There's probably a fire extinguisher in this room, but we sure hope we never have to use it, right? And that's the crisis insurance function, which kings can play. The other picture is the king of Thailand in the 1990s, after where there was huge battles in the streets between the government and the and a bunch of protesters. And king basically brought these two leaders on TV and yelled at them, and that resolved the problem. So that's a kind of function which a constitutional monarch can play. I think there's something interesting about monarchy in particular too, because monarchy is a kind of asymmetric mechanism of integration, in the sense that monarchs almost always have somewhere in a religious sense, they certainly are standing for the side of they reassure the side of society that cares about property rights. If you're going to have a communist revolution, you first thing you do is you attack the monarch. So the monarch tells us that there's someone who's strong enough. It's like a signal in some sense, or a trigger for telling us as a society that there's someone who really wants to, someone drawing the attention of opponents of a basic system of property rights and markets. This means that perhaps in a situation where conservatives are strong and threatened, keeping a monarch can actually provide some asymmetric reassurance and thus disempowering the radical challengers. It's also the case historically that minorities, like monarchy, Franz Joseph is an example, the Ottoman Empire, minorities like monarchy because if they're not ontological part of a nation by virtue of their ethnicity, they're able to signal that they are loyal to a nation by proclaiming loyalty to the king. Thailand, again, a country I've spent some time in, Muslims in the South are loyal to the king. And that's a way of assuring the Buddhist majority that, okay, they're not really threatening us in some sense. It's a way of communicating that. Another theme, I think, or another service that monarchs provide, and this is particularly important in our era, is an upper bound on ambition, particularly of populists. Let me say something about that. Donald Trump, in one of his great speeches, said, I speak for the people. No one else knows what the people want. And all those other people, they don't matter. In other words, the people are who I say they are. And this is, of course, always the populist claim, that every institution between the populist and the people is suspect, and that's why they try to destroy institutions almost uniformly. I don't think that claim can work in a country with a constitutional monarchy. The job of representing the people is already taken by some figurehead puppet sitting in, Windsor Castle. It's impossible to make the claim. And so Boris Johnson, who certainly had some populist kind of moves and also very good hair, like Donald Trump, still could not, it was not the threat to democracy that Donald Trump clearly is. No one thought, even when Johnson prorogued Parliament, that he was going to try to stay around forever or overturn the British government. It just wasn't on the table. I looked at the share of populist parties' votes in various elections in Europe. My data is from 2018, so it's not up to date. But one of the things you see is that the populist share is the lowest, down at the bottom three are Luxembourg, Belgium, the United Kingdom, Sweden, Denmark, Spain, Netherlands. These are all in the bottom half. And I see no monarchies in the top half. It suggests that maybe there is something there about putting an ambition on this kind of claim. Looking at some data on speeches in Parliament, it turns out that democratic monarchies have far fewer populist speeches than non-monarchic democracies. So there might be something there as well. I also looked at some data on crises. So Arthur Banks has this comprehensive data on things like assassinations and strikes and such. And I compared, in each case, just within the universe of democracies since 1950, monarchies and non-monarchies. And for every one of these things, they happen much less often in monarchic government. It may be that crisis insurance, just the presence of it, actually acts to take out some of the most violent claims in society and stabilize us. Well, you might say, okay, that's fine, but aren't there other institutions which can provide focal points and do that kind of work? And there certainly are. I would call these alternative insurance providers. And you might think of a ceremonial president in a country like Germany as playing that role, usually a seasoned politician, and might even have some advantages, because with the monarchy, we're not selecting on the basis of any skill, right? In fact, probably over time, there's regression to the mean, and sometimes monarchies have a lot of inbreeding, and maybe so there may be even suboptimal. Random, we're basically like a random element. So when there's a crisis, how will they know? And how can we rely on them to provide the good solution? And it's a genuine concern. Against that, there is the problem of ceremonial presidents that if they are, in fact, former politicians, as they often are, they might be seen as partisan in some sense. And they also lack all this kind of mystique and such that the monarchs have about, they would generate a kind of automatic loyalty, at least among some players. So, there are an alternative. They might be better, they might be worse. You also could say courts, obviously. And here, in other words, if there's a crisis, why don't we just, like in the Spanish coup, why didn't they just go to court? And of course, where the problem is that courts are not outside of the political system in the way that monarchs are, by definition. Courts are in the political system. You can't answer to a question that is, and I'm thinking of the literature on self-enforcement, right? How do we know that, why will people obey the courts? That's always a question. You have to have a story as to why obeying the courts is an equilibrium solution, and I'm just not sure there is one. Furthermore, courts do not have the ability to perform that integrating function, getting minorities to feel loyal to the country and things like this. They're not communicating anything about the basis of the nation. So I would acknowledge you have other mechanisms that can play these roles, but there still might be something unique and helpful about monarchs. One particular feature, and now we get to my question about why are monarchies ever restored, is sometimes after periods of costly fighting, you can bring back the monarchy precisely to symbolize the ontological unity of the nation. Cambodia had a horrible civil war for about more than 2 decades, ending in roughly 1993. And at that point, the UN came in and they wrote a new constitution, and it brought back the constitutional monarchy. This monarchy is extremely weak. It has to come from the royal family of King Sihanouk, but the selection of the monarch is done by a committee, a government committee that includes the prime minister. So this is, rather than the king selecting the prime minister selects the king when there's an opening in the job. So extremely weak, probably not even going to provide solutions, provide any crisis insurance. That certainly is symbolizing the idea that we're no longer at war, our biggest values are continuing, and we're in for a period of stability. So that might be some reason that we would take them back. I'm mindful of not talking too long, but I'll show a couple other slides. Actually, first I'll show this one. So I'm providing a sort of functional account. Of course, ideas about monarchy might matter. And here I'm contrasting the monarchies in the 19th century of China and Japan. The man on the left is the Meiji Emperor. And the Meiji Emperor was, those of you who know history, restored to power nominally in 1868. It's called the Meiji Restoration. The emperor always was there. He was just composing poetry in the imperial palace. The Japanese theory of the imperial house is that it's an unbroken line descending from the sun goddess 2,600 years ago. So you have these people, they're not very important. They were constitutional monarchs for most of that period. What happens? You have a big crisis in 1868 when the Americans show up, and there's a civil war. And what they're able to do is say, we're going to appoint this completely figurehead person as a constitutional monarch going forward. We will modernize the Constitution along the European lines. And there's no fear that that person would actually exercise real power. So that was a way, that idea of the monarchy, that concept of it, allowed Japan to have the stable rule to become the powerful industrial nation it became. Contrast that with China. In Chinese history, the most fundamental fact, which every student of Chinese history knows, is that it comes in dynasties. And a dynasty is not descended from the sun goddess. The dynasty is a family that rules for a while it has the mandate of heaven. And when things go bad, the mandate of heaven is withdrawn, and there will be chaos and war and famine. And that's a signal to the rest of us that maybe this monarchy's got to go and we got to replace him with a new one. In other words, they'll have the idea that monarchy is renewable rather than permanent, but it's also powerful. And so this is a picture of the last Chinese emperor. This is actually in the 1960s. He survived World War II, survived the Chinese Revolution, and was kept in, you see him wearing a Mao type of outfit, that's in a prison in China. But the point is that he was not integrating the country in any way. He was, when things started to go bad in China in the 19th century, no one said, let's keep these people around. And the monarchy falls and you get the Chinese Communist Party with all of its complexity and such. And so that's I think, an important feature in terms of thinking about how ideas might shape the bargaining process between society and the king. Finally, I looked a little bit at data on the performance of these puppets for us. You know, when you go talk to someone in the United Kingdom, particularly a Republican, they'd say, why do we have these people? They're so useless. They cost us all this money. And so, well, you can look at the service they provide. That was a common theme in the crowd. We're providing service to society. What is their service? They are showing up and doing events. And I gathered some data on the budget, the number of lawyers, and the relative efficiency. And you can see that the United Kingdom is actually a pretty good value. It's $12,000 per engagement. That's not very much money for the king or for one of the royal family to show up. Whereas in other countries, Belgium is more expensive. That's not a very admirable monarchy in terms of its history in any case. So anyway, this is something one can think of if you think of it as an insurance policy. We might ask, what is the value? Now, I think I'll jump ahead. It's not that fun to be a monarch. And that's why we're now seeing a raft of people trying to pull at Prince Harry. Prince Harry, of course, famously left the monarchy, and that was a bitter thing. But he's not alone. Just in the last year, the man on the upper left is Prince Laurent of Belgium, who is a kind of a playboy who once did a business deal with Gaddafi. He's kind of a black sheep. He just said, I'm going abroad. He didn't say where he's going. I'm quitting. This is the one of the younger daughters of the Emperor of Japan, and I think a princess in Norway, also just leaving. Can't remember if it's Norway or Sweden. Sorry, I mixed them up. So, you know, that tells us something too, that they're not really prisoners of society. They're performing a service for us, but it's not that fun to be one of them. And that suggests that we should revisit, in some sense, and by the way, you could talk about them from a human rights perspective. They lack the basic human rights that all of us have. They have no freedom of expression. They have no freedom of movement. They really are constrained in many ways. That suggests that maybe it is we should thank them if you're living in one of these societies, rather than treating them as this rather useless vestige. They may be providing a constant service. All right, to summarize, essentially, one way to think about this in economic terms is the discount rate for monarchy. If you know that your heirs are going to be around for a long time, then you have a low discount rate, and that's probably lower when there's no actual stakes of power. You get rents, you get to live in this nice palace and all this stuff, you get some prestige, but you don't have to make any of the tough political decisions, which actually can lead, if you make them badly, to great cost for the nation for which you'd be blamed and possibly deposed. I also think there is something about this asymmetric quality. Monarchs are a reassurance to political conservatives, right? Radicals and people on the left never like monarchy. And so having the monarchy around, even if policy is left-wing, as in Spain, when the socialists were elected. It's a kind of a reassurance which can help reduce what Weingast calls the rationality of fear, which is when you feel like your fundamental interests are threatened, that's when you come out to the streets, and it disrupts political equilibria, the rationality of fear. And so monarchy can reduce the level of that fear just by being there, just by serving as a marionette or a puppet. I guess the final thing I'll say is that I really think that this getting away from the idea that kings are just providing some service involving war is probably a good idea if we're going to try to understand this particular puzzle. And, in my view, there's something about the internal game and the external game and their interaction, which explains why it is that constitutional monarchs survive in our general world of republics. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Oh, it works. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom, for this wonderful talk. I'm sure that the audience has the one or the other question regarding constitutional monarchy. Who wants to break the ice? Yes, please.
And
what about that microphone?
Yeah. And also, why don't you tell me your name and who you are?
Yes. Hi, I'm Marcus. I came here to hear the garden lecture, which is next week. So I came instead here. Yes.
2 for the price of 1. It's cheap.
Yeah, but I'm very, very happy. But I heard the talk. And my question, and I'm a singing student, so I'm not even at the university. Yes. And my question was regarding your about the alternatives to constitutional monarch, and you said there was courts, and that courts were integrated into politics. And I was thinking about our highest court, the Constitutional Court, which is even called Constitutional Court, and they are an alternative to a constitutional monarch, but they have real power. Yes, so in Germany, like if they say something, they still have a conflict, and then it's solved completely. And that's the feeling I get in our country. So could you tell us, in what way is this court now integrated into politics, and what is the problem there? And in which way it is a valid alternative to a constitutional monarch, as it is constitutional. Yeah.
Yes. Excellent. So, yes, I'm thinking about the question of, why does democracy survive? You have factions that are competing for power and such, and what is to keep the government from abusing your rights, for example? And the common answer is the Constitutional Court. If I have a trouble, I go to the Constitutional Court, and they will pronounce, and everyone will listen. But the perspective I'm coming from is, why is it that everyone listens to the Constitutional Court? You happen to have a good one. If I could trade our court for your court, believe me, I would do that in a minute. Because we have a highly politicized court, which one of the justices was just shown to be flying Trump flags outside of his house, and he has decisions that he has to make about this, no ethics whatsoever. And I think our court might be more typical. Courts, when they what we've seen over the last couple of decades is what we call the judicialization of politics in many countries. More and more political questions go into court. When you judicialize politics, you politicize the judiciary. It's a natural thing because they're exercising power. And that's why I don't think it is a universal solution or one that is always going to work, particularly for this crisis resolution function. Imagine that you have a civil war kind of thing about to break out, and the court, our American court says, no, you guys go back and you stay. I'm not sure that's going to work anymore in our country. So that's my only perspective. They're good, and if you could get your court, I would take one. If I could get your court, I would take it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting talk. I'm not going to announce this yourself, even though I know who you are.
Oh, yes.
George Vanberg from Duke University, student of the German Constitutional Court. That's right. I want to ask you an antecedent question in a certain sense, because I very much like the thinking about the coordinative function or sort of political leadership as a solution to coordination problems, and that it's intuitive that monarchs can serve that role, right? And sort of the contrast to the Olson story. But I wonder about the following thing.
the emergence of an institution that serves as a focal point to solve coordination problems is itself a coordination problem, right?
Yeah.
And so I wonder whether you have any thoughts about how that process gets off the ground, and whether that's not the place where the violence and the war story and the coordination story actually meet, that it's in that original setting.
I think that's right. I mean, that's the standard story that you have. So 100,000 years ago, we were all living in small bands of up to about 500 people would be the minimum. That's the minimum breeding population for human beings. So even if we lived in a smaller band, we'd have to come together and feast and party every once in a while with a bigger group. So everyone would know at least 500 people or so in the course of their life at a very minimum. And over time, obviously, we have the exercise of power, and particularly developments in technology, which allow us to stabilize and settle down and such. And there's a very standard story of agriculture leading to domination through taxation. This is a Jim Scott kind of story, something like that. So I think that's all true. But the only thing I want to raise is that there might be a way in which epistemic power is valuable there. That is, the kings always want to be seen as performing a service. It's much easier to get people to pay the taxes when it's not just a matter of brute force, but a matter of legitimacy and mystic quality and all of those things that we associate with kings, including judging, might actually be what makes the force not have to be exercised. So I think they probably go together in most historical cases, and I included that diocese thing because that's a story where the epistemic power comes first. Once the technology of being a king is already known, people say, oh, they got a king, maybe we want a king too. By the way, the Bible is consistent with my story. Those of you who read the Bible will know that after the Hebrews come to the Promised Land, the first phase of government is of judges. That's what happens in the Old Testament. God sets up judges for the people, and it's only in the book of Samuel that the people go to the judge and they say, we want a king. We want to be like all those other countries. And Samuel says, no, you don't want that. The king's going to tax your staff and take the best of your land and abuse you and force you to go to war. The people say, no, we really want it. He says, no, you really don't. And he tries to convince them, finally, have it your way. And then they get the kings, King Saul and then King David. So anyway, that's there may be something historically or extending your power might come from wisdom and not just power.
Victor. I'm Victor Wenberg from Pfaffenweiler. You have this category, constitutional monarchy, as one homogeneous group. My question is, are there relevant differences within this category according to the procedures they may be democratically terminated? And my second question is, are there relevant differences with regard to the actual political power monarchs can exercise? I'm thinking of the Principality of Liechtenstein, where the prince has considerable political power.
Yeah, great. So clearly there's a spectrum of arrangements between no power and lots of power. I'm going to spin it. Maybe I'll go down to my slide about Thailand, which I didn't have time to show you. Sorry, take a minute, a lot of slides. I used to live in Thailand, and I find it very interesting from this point of view. The king of Thailand, the monarchies in Thailand became constitutional monarchies in 1932 in a coup. And that particular king was very weak, and he surrendered authority. And by an accident that happened a few years later, this man here, King Rama IX, became the king after his brother was assassinated in a still unsolved mystery, dangerous position. He ruled for 7 decades. And during this period, he built up so much authority that there was anyone who wanted to have a coup, and you have a lot of coups in that country, you'd have to go seek his permission first. That's not written in anywhere in the text. It was a constitutional monarchy with massive extra constitutional power. So even as we say that, when you look at the British colonies and you read their constitutions, you would say the Constitution over-specifies the power. It says the king forms the government, the king does this. In Thailand, it's the opposite. The constitution totally underspecifies the power, and yet it is still a constitutional monarchy. Now, his heir is not a very popular man. This is the current king of Thailand. That's his wife. He's a playboy. He spent most of the pandemic here in Germany, some of you may know, with his harem of 19 women and his various wives and stuff. He had a birthday party for his little dog there at one point during the pandemic. And this has led to a big challenge. So he's also trying to reclaim actual power. He's trying to exercise the power that the last king held but never used. And so this is leading, I think, to a major challenge, and probably, I believe, the end of the monarchy. His son, who is here, has some sort of autism or something like the Crown Prince of Thailand. And so, in any case, that's a long way of saying power can vary even within a monarchy, depending on who's exercising it. Clearly, anyone the power can. And attempts to expand formal power might be rebuffed. I suppose that's what I would say. Now, you mentioned the Principality of Liechtenstein. Obviously, it's very tiny. And I understand that they also have, I was told by George last night, the ability to eliminate the monarchy. The monarchy can constitutionally be eliminated through referendum. It's amazing. I've never heard of any other case like that. So that's a monarch that really trusts that his people like him. Obviously, when you put that in the Constitution, and it's a great commitment device. I think it's really a nice institutional design. I wish that they'd have that in Thailand. They might not be in the crisis that they're going to face very soon. But anyway, that's all a very long answer to say you're absolutely correct that there is a spectrum of power, and that probably deserves better mapping by me. In my table, the constitutional monarchies, which are on the non-democratic side of the spectrum, have much less power, formal and informal, than those in democracies. King of Cambodia, the emperor in medieval Japan really didn't have any power at all, zero. But as you move to more democratic power, that's where the functions of helping to resolve problems among parties and such actually become more important, having a focal point when conflict is out in the open.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Extremely interesting. My name is Maria Groban. I used to be an English teacher and nurse. And it's very nice. You began with a film, yes, mentioning that from the crown, that the royals used to be marionettes or prisoners. Perhaps they are prisoners. And they are devised, and we also. What about the studies in the last time about the genes of these royals? We are thought about or heard about porphyria, which used to be a royal disease. You think about the poem from Robert Browning, Porphyria, the last batches. Shall I come to examples to Queen Victoria? She passed her hemophilia gene to two of her daughters. The great challenge the royals have to do to succeed or pass their genes further is a problem. And why is hemophilia called a royal disease? I don't want to enter, because I'm not able to discuss the biological phenomena. Some know about it, but these phenomena plays a very important role in the consciousness, in the abilities of the soul, of the mind of these royals, and the show has to go on. Well, I thank you very much.
Oh, it's a great question. And of course, I don't know much about it. Obviously, I haven't studied the genetic composition, but there is the problem of royals. The primary is an optimal. So I brought up this slide because this woman here, Princess Mako of Japan, that is her husband, and he is a commoner. He didn't come from royal blood. And in order for her to marry him, she had to leave the royal family. They're now living in New York, where he's a lawyer, and they're just ordinary people on the streets of New York. It's a much better life for her. But that's because they had this bizarre rule about pure blood in the royal family. And I think what your question is hinting at, and I don't want to be very crude, but when the gene pool is too limited, that's when you get a lot of these diseases and things like this. This idea of we can only measure people in our status actually means you're deeming your offspring and your grand offspring to, to idiocy, if I can put it that way. And so it's a bad strategy. So we might look, and it's something I could research actually, where families throughout history, how do they ensure that the gene pool is diverse and good? So it's worth looking into.
Thank you very much. My name is Christoph Wirtz. I'm a journalist. I used to study history and politics at this university. I'd like to come back to your slide about vaccination for populists.
Yeah.
You're talking about integration and crisis insurance, and there I see the United Kingdom at the smallest number. I think it's 2018, right?
Yeah, so obviously it's now my time.
Yeah, but 2016 we had the Brexit referendum.
Yeah.
And that was purely populist, was maybe the most successful populist project in Western history after the war. And the Crown did nothing to prevent it. So where was the integration? Where was the crisis insurance there? That's the first part. The second was Walter Bagehot, who all know the famous quote, "We must not let daylight upon the magic." So we know about your family in Great Britain a lot more than we all want to know. So is Walter Bagehot wrong, or are we witnessing the last act?
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, there's are we witnessing the last act? I don't think so. I mean, I think that they're just too entertaining, and there's too many newspapers to be sold. But it's interesting. What is the what is the kind of crisis for which the royal family would intervene? And remember, in The Crown there is one example, and that was when Lord Milbarrow in the 1967 is going to overthrow Wilson's government because it's a socialist government. And the Queen says, absolutely not. You bring the whole thing down if you try that. So that's partly an internal, she's playing the internal game to protect the overall status and power externally, and that seems good. She did resolve a crisis. No one knows this, and there's some historical evidence for it. It wasn't just made up for the Crown, although a lot of people deny it. You would always say historian. So look, I think that's certainly the case. Should she have stopped Brexit? I don't think so at all. I think that clearly this is basic democratic principle. When this was not about populist policies, it's about populist parties and leaders. And so I think none of the major British parties would have counted for that. The UKIP might, and they don't really win much in Britain itself. And also this is changing. I mean, it could be that this data was just of this year. I haven't updated it. It might be that we now see that seeing on ambition isn't working quite as well as populism becomes more popular everywhere else. So, but I think it would have been quite inappropriate for her to intervene against this policy. It was, might be, you might not like it, I might not like it, but it was democratic, clearly, infra-democratic. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Hans-Joachim Haber. I'm the retired director of the German Military Archives here in Freiburg.
Yeah.
And I want to make a comment on your slide with the people who quit the royal families, which is, you mentioned the...
I have them somewhere, yeah.
Yes. On the left, upper left, you have the Prince Laurent from Belgium.
Yeah.
And I was just you made a little comment on the Belgian monarchy, which was not very positive.
No.
And I wanted to just tell you, I lived 4 years in Belgium, and I was a German diplomat there, and so I had many contacts with the government and all these things. And you see the country always drifting between the French-speaking and the Flemish and Dutch-speaking, but they still keep together. And once the chief of staff of the Belgian army, he told me, You know what keeps this country together are three things. First is football. Everybody loves football. The second is social security. And the most important is the royal family. And that is very true. You go, even the most extremist Flemish, you will never say a word against the monarchy. And that keeps this country together. And I think that is quite a positive one.
Thank you very much. It's a good comment, and it shows that integration function. Let me defend my comment, what I had in mind when I was so... yeah.
All these you mentioned, these are people which are not in line to succeed.
No, that's
so
true.
that's why they quit, because they are frustrated.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Prince Harry, he's number two. The title of his book was, by the way, it's called Spare, because the idea you need an heir and the spare, and he didn't want to be the spare, but he also didn't want to be the heir. Spare, apparently, and it shows you how out of touch they are. In ordinary British colloquial slang, it means an idiot or something like that, which they didn't even know when they chose this title. But let me say a little bit about Belgium. I think you're absolutely right about the integration. Why am I so down on the Belgian monarchy? Obviously, the Belgian Congo genocidal program is, that's the source of their wealth. So there's a reason to be a little suspicious. I look back to World War II, and there's some wonderful stories of monarchies. Generally speaking, the countries which were monarchies did better in terms of protecting the Jews of the country. The Netherlands queen was only so-so. She left. The Belgian king, I think, stayed, if I remember, for a long time. And so that's not a good mark for the family. Contrast that with the Norwegian king or the Danish king, who the Danish king, apocryphally, it turns out not to be true, but put on the yellow star. The Norwegian king refused to recognize the Quisling government and fled, and that was followed by his Supreme Court denying it recognition. So the puppet government in Norway never had any legitimacy because the king stood up. Morocco, when the Vichy French wanted the king of Morocco to turn over the Jewish resident to Moroccan Jews, he said, no, they're my subjects. In other words, the minority was protected by the king against the Vichy French. That's a great story. The Belgians didn't look so good in that regard when you compare all the European monarchies. Generally speaking, the monarchies were better, but they weren't so good in Belgium. I didn't know enough about the details. You would know about who was in charge at that time, but I do take the point about integration. I thank you for it.
I think Bernd Kramer is the last question.
Bernd Kramer, Freiburg. Just one question. Should more countries become constitutional monarchies? They are very sympathetic. So do you think this kind of government regime will solve our problems? Polarizing societies, for example, deep social divisions.
The question is, can you create one out of nothing? And that would be the problem. Remember, by the way, in that silly little almost coup you had last year, right? Remember, there was some minor post that said he was going to be the new king in Germany. It was such a joke. So, what's that? He's on trial. Good. I mean, as he should be. But the point is, it's very hard to create. But we do have examples. Like I mentioned the country of Bhutan, where I think of this glorious, Buddhist, wonderful kingdom. And the monarchy is only 100 years old. The king just decided that we're not really going to be sustainable if I have absolute power and everyone's treating me as like some kind of deity. So we're turning into a constitutional monarchy. We have a government. They're responsible to the parliament, and we're just going to perform some symbolic functions. That move is clearly a good one. If you're an absolute monarchy or an executive monarchy, clearly go to rev down your power. I would say that for Kuwait and Bahrain and Saudi. But for a country like yours or mine, I don't think it's very possible to do it. And we'll have such a Republican tradition that it just would never work. And this gets to where the ideas matter. There's some background cultural conditions. It's hard to create a tradition out of nothing.
Yes, I said Bernd Kramer as the last question because I also wanted to ask one. So, and when I'm looking at the questions and the discussions we had up to now, one point that comes up to my mind is regarding the gene question, that some of the European constitutional monarchies made a step forward by accepting normal people as being potential partners and could be married by one of the kings or the princes that could finally succeed to one of the monarchs. We have this in Spain. We have it in the Scandinavian countries. I think the UK still is different in that regard, as far as I have in mind, but I'm not sure.
The Queen of Netherlands is
also, yes, the Queen of Netherlands is also a case where you have this. So actually, this is a possibility of evolutionary sustainability of the constitutional monarchy when they are getting a better gene pool inside in order to survive and also be accepted in the population. And my second remark, when you just said in the end, you in my country, we have a Republican tradition. Well, that might be true with respect to the US, and not so true with respect to Germany. And there was this court question. Sometimes I have the impression that the Federal Constitutional Court is something like replacing or wishes in Germany to have something like a monarch. And this leads to the question, to what extent do the procedures that are lying behind sustain these arrangements? So when you compare the Supreme Court with the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany, there still is this shorter tradition in Germany, so to speak, to have a kind of consensual arrangement to appoint these judges.
Yes.
And they are not appointed for life, they are appointed for a certain time period, such that the political changes are more easily reflected in the Constitutional Court, but it is by the procedures of appointing them less prone to polarization than you have in the US, for example. So perhaps these kind of procedures might play a role in constitutional monarchy as well, in the sense that the different abilities of the constitutional monarchs, their powers, are also due to the different procedures that are in place.
Well, yes, there's obviously procedures about monarchy, and those are changing, as you pointed out, with regard to commoners, but also with regard to women being allowed to inherit the throne, which in many countries is very new. And so, yes, we do see those procedures change. More generally, I would just say that this is why we study institutions. You know, this is why I study institutions and why you do as well, which is it's the institutional structures, but also ideas about the institutions that kind of interact to give legitimacy to, let's say, the Constitutional Court of Germany, or give legitimacy to the King of Thailand. It's something about ideas, but also the way that they come into power and what their formal powers are, always interacting with informal things as well. And that's I think why monarchy is such a fascinating institution. They are our prisoners in the sense that we like to, they entertain us and such. But I think the particular way that formal and informal powers interact, it's a lot harder to study in a sense than, say, the Constitutional Court, where we tend to use very much the pure procedures of appointment, and we can say that your model is better, producing different outcomes than mine. With monarchy, it's a little harder. And I think that's just one reason it's fascinating.
Wonderful. So thank you again for this wonderful and excellent talk. And thank you very much for the discussions and all the ideas you spread during these discussions. And also thank you, the audience, for being so patient at the beginning, being so patient throughout, and all your questions which were really very, very excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much.